Well, I am talking to the one and only Ian McFadyen.
Yep.
With
They limited to one. They stopped production after me. They went, oh God, no, okay, that's it. Just let that one go.
yeah, but you have a big background in TV, radio, writing, and I could go all the way back.
I can go too far back. This is the problem. So.
But you mainly know Ian from the comedy company, as well as some other things, but we'll get to that later. But what would be, or how far can we go back, shall we say?
As far as comedy?
Yes.
Well, that depends whether you're talking about actually doing comedy or kind of comedy influences. I mean, if you want to go back to my influences of comedy, I was watching an interview with John Cleese the other day, a very old one, for about 15 years ago, and he was talking about his influences, and they were remarkably similar. I was lucky enough to be sort of at primary school in the 50s when television first started. And when television first started in Australia, which is old black and white, it was a very sort of golden age for comedy because a lot of the great comedians were still alive. And these people in America, for example, who started on vaudeville, like the Marx Brothers and the Three Stooges and Burns and Allen and Jack Benny, they started off as vaudevillians back in the 1920s, had gone to radio, they'd gone to movies, and they'd ended up on television. So all these people, Phil Silvers, Jack Benny, Abbott and Costello, Burns and Allen, were doing TV shows then. And you got to see them. And they were quite remarkable, some of them. I mean, some of those shows, like the Burns and Allen show, which is a classic sort of husband and wife sitcom, when they first started working in the late 40s on television, they were going live to air because there was no videotape. And you look at that with great admiration now and think, imagine doing a sitcom live to air, where there's no possibility of a take two at all. You're actually watching it in real time. And so if you had a scene change, you had to have a commercial break, and you'd rush off and get changed and come back and be on stage. So it was like doing theatre. So it was good to watch these people because they were they were brilliant people. And people like Jack Benny had already, by the time he got on TV, he'd already been doing films and radio and so on and live performances for like 40, 50 years. And that was sort of swept away in the 60s when television went into those kind of rather lame sitcoms like I Dream of Jeannie and kind of what happened was all those great comedians died.
Yeah.
And with that, and it was sort of apparent that if you haven't got any great comedians, how do you make funny TV shows? And the answer was they came up with this idea: let's have a funny premise. Let's have a man marries a witch, and she can wiggle her nose and make things, or a man marries a genie who's in a bottle, and that gives you an opportunity to virtually have the same joke every week. Every week you can have more or less the same thing as things like the Addams Family or the Munsters. You would have a premise where there's a family of classic horror movie monsters, Frankenstein monster, and all living in a house. And that means every week you'd have pretty much the same joke, which is that Marilyn brings home her school teacher to sort of meet the family, and they all get a shock. And there's very little, invention. So what that meant is you didn't have to have necessarily comedians in the role. You could just get actors to play whoever it was, Jeannie's husband and so on. And you could get a team of writers and say, look, this is the formula for the show. So all of those kind of sitcoms throughout the 60s and 70s were very formulaic. You didn't have to be a great comedy writer to write an episode of the Munsters or something. You did have to write something maybe like the Dick Van Dyke Show, which was written by Carl Reiner, who's a sort of a genius. But most of those Hollywood sort of corny sitcoms in the 60s and 70s, they were shot in Hollywood, not in New York, and they weren't done in front of a live audience, whereas all the old ones were done, Jack Benny Show, and all actually done live in front of an audience. So it lost its theatre. It became like little corny sitcoms, and television comedy sort of died for a while. The second sort of wave, however, was in the 60s, was satire. So in the early 60s, 1961, 62, in England, you had David Frost does the Frost Report, which is a sort of a weekly political satire show. And he brings in these young comedians like John Cleese, who's just out of Cambridge, and Ronnie Barker and Ronnie Corbett, and they do very, very funny contemporary political satire. This is a whole new thing. And it was a whole new thing for a couple of reasons. One is that television had never really attempted much in the way of social commentary or social satire. And also it was interesting because this was the first time, I think, probably in history, that people with university degrees were going into comedy. because comedy had traditionally been, it was a working class thing. You know, people came out of the working class. They got up in vaudeville doing funny songs or slapstick routines or whatever, and they became the great comedians. There were not many people. I mean, people like Charlie Chaplin never went to university. You know, it wasn't something that university graduates did. But in that period around 1960, when Peter Cook and Dudley Moore and Jonathan Miller and Alan Bennett took a university review called Beyond the Fringe. They took it to Edinburgh and got a prize, and then they took it to New York, and it was a very, very funny show. And all of a sudden, comedy was a possible career for people at uni. And then at the same round, soon after that, you had John Cleese and Graham Garden and Tim Brooke Taylor, who came out of Cambridge. And again, they did sort of funny reviews at university, and then they said, and some people came and said, well, you want to do this down the West End? And so all of a sudden, there were university graduates going into comedy, and that of course changed comedy from being just, you know, I mean, there was nothing wrong with that sort of working class comedy, that Jerry Lewis. It was always, comedy used to be usually about the fall guy, you know, the little guy it was the Charlie Chaplin or Bob Hope, the pale face. He was a schmuck basically. It was always based on the idea of the schmuck who was up against, you know, forces and won out at the end. All of a sudden, comedy became much more satirical. It became much more. And that sort of culminated in a way at the end of the 60s. That culminates with something like Monty Python, where you've got a whole bunch of university graduates, you know, people who did medical degrees or whatever, who studied philosophy, doing these sketches on television. And you get absurd sketches in Monty Python, like the Greek philosophers playing the German philosophers at football.
Yeah,
the
soccer
match. And you've got that soccer match with going, and Kierkegaard, he's not quite sure, he's still thinking Aristotle. Wait a minute, you know, oh my God, Archimedes has had an idea, he's got Eureka, he's kicked the ball. I mean, that's in one sense a very snobbish sketch, because unless you have a bit of a working knowledge of philosophy or whatever, or their sketch about Thomas Hardy writing Test of the D'Urbervilles, you know, or whatever, in the Wembley play. Yeah. Again, unless you've done a literature degree, you don't know who the hell these people are. So it was comedy by kind of educated people for educated people. So it was a sort of first real middle class comedy. In Australia, that caught on about 10 years later, when you started to get, well, Max probably later, about 20 years before that started to happen. The first inkling of university graduates starting to do comedy that I'm aware of was around 1974 in Melbourne. A guy called John Pinder opened a tiny little cafe called the Flying Trapeze Cafe. He'd been a sort of a rock and roll entrepreneur, and he decided he wanted to open this little theatre restaurant. So it was a tiny little shop. It's seated, only had about 12 little tables, so you only ever had about 50 people at most, crammed in, you know, shoulder to shoulder, trying to eat like on an airline, you know. And a stage about the size of this table with a piano on it. And he kind of invited people to come and be entertainers there. So you'd have this meal. There was a guy called Ross who cooked the meals, and you paid. It wasn't much in those days, like $10 for a meal and a show. And it was interesting because almost overnight, people suddenly became cabaret artists. And one of the first ones, for example, was Rod Quantock, Mary Keneally, Steve Blackburn and Jeff Brooks, who had come out of the Architecture Review at Melbourne Uni. So that was one of the sort of first, these were people who'd been doing sketches at Melbourne Uni in the Archie Review. They formed a group called Razzle Dazzle. They went on stage and started doing sketches on stage. And a few other people also started to get up and do acts. Some of them were singing acts, musical acts, juggling acts, clowning, all that kind of stuff. A couple of years later, Rod Quantock and Mary Keneally and Co. opened up their own cafe, only about 6 doors down, called the Comedy Cafe, in conjunction with John Clark. And that was a bigger venue. That had a downstairs restaurant, with a tiny little stage, and they had an upstairs space, which they called the Banana Lounge. So all of a sudden there were 3 venues where people could be working.
Wow.
Again, a couple of years after that, John Pinder went and found a big old, I think it was like an Oddfellows hall, one of those big lodge halls over in Collingwood. And that had it was sort of like a cinema. It had a balcony. And downstairs, he fitted that out to have a lot of tables and chairs. You could have about 200, 250 people in there on a Christmas, in the Christmas period. And upstairs, there was a little space that they fitted out as a stand-up club. So now there were sort of 5 venues where people could work. The downstairs space of the Last Laugh was reserved for big shows. So Circus Oz would perform there, or John would bring out the brass band from Canada, which was a very funny musical act. But in time, other people were encouraged to do shows there. So people would start doing stand-up comedy upstairs in a little room called The Joke. And if they proved to be very good, maybe John would bring them downstairs. So people like Winnie Harmer might start off doing stand-up up there and then be brought downstairs to do a show with Richard Stubbs and Russell Gilbert or something downstairs to that. So by around about by 1980, you had just in this one sort of square kilometre of Fitzroy Collingwood in Melbourne, about 5 venues where you could work if you were a budding comedian or whatever. And that was the sort of world that I, by more or less accident, fell into around about 1981. And a lot of those people, of course, disappeared, but it was also a sort of a channel by which, again, people could come from, say, Melbourne University. So there was a whole team that did a review at Melbourne University around about that time, around about the early 80s. And again, John Pinder saw them and said, I'll come and do a show at the Last Laugh. Now that team was Rob Sitch, Magda Zavansky, Mark Downey, etc. In other words, the group we now know as Working Dog, the people who've done, who did, or the people who went into Fast Forward and the people who have done Utopia and Hollow Men and all that stuff. So they again were a sort of a university group that again gave up. This is a big sacrifice for these people. I mean, these are people saying, well, we're not going to be architects, we're not going to be doctors, we're not going to be whatever it is, dentists, we're going to go and make a career of comedy.
Yeah.
And so that new career path emerged. And I was all through that, I was only on the periphery of that. I never worked at the Flying Trapeze, so friends of mine did. And I was doing children's theatre. I started as a social worker. I became a teacher. I went into doing children's theatre because I'd done a lot of theatre at Melbourne Uni. From doing children's educational theatre, I went to the ABC as a producer of educational programs, and that gave me a slight advantage in that I learned how to direct TV studio. So I knew a bit about videotape. I knew a bit about multi-camera production.
Yep.
But I had no intention of going into performance. I had no interest in being a comedian.
So you're all mainly behind the scenes.
I was a writer. Yeah, I spent the 70s writing stage shows for people, writing and directing kids theatre, making educational programs, Sesame Street type programs for kids, literacy programs. And it was only sort of around about 1980 when a friend of mine, Peter Moon, rang up, and he and his friend, our friend Eddie Zandberg, had been doing a sort of a double act around some of these venues. For some reason, the Goldstein brothers, even though Peter wasn't Jewish, but I think he always wished he was Jewish, but he got together with Ed Zandberg, and they did this thing about being 2 Jewish boys, which is really, I don't know whether that comes under the heading of cultural appropriation or not, but they said, would you like to sort of join us? And not as a third Jewish boy, but just doing sketches. And so we got together and we started writing a lot of stuff. And we did our first real gig at the Flying Trapeze, which by then was owned by someone else. This was like 1981. This is about 7 years after it first opened. We got up, we did a late show. We did I can remember it vividly because it was in January and it was about 40 degrees in Melbourne. I mean, Melbourne gets very, very hot in summer. And the audience in this tiny little cramped venue had already watched a whole show with a group called Oztalgia and Barkus, who were rather aggressive comics who made fun of the audience and threw things at them and so on. But they'd been through this whole show, and it was like 11:30 at night on a Friday night. We came in and we did another 40 minutes, but they were very good. We kept them there. They didn't leave. And the guy, Ralph, who ran the place, came back and said, oh, that was good, guys. You want to come back and do another late show tomorrow? So we came back the next night, and we did it 40 minutes again. And he came in afterwards and he said, you did different stuff the second night. We said yes. Because we didn't realise then that most people who did shows at these things had one act. I mean, they had their 20-minute routine, and they just did it for year after year after year.
Yeah,
I mean, they
without any tweaking.
Yeah, there was not much tweaking. But we had written so many sketches. And anyway, because we had a lot of material, again, the whole story becomes a series of accidents after this. So the way after we did these couple of nights at the Flying Trapeze, there was another comedian working at the Comedy Cafe down the road who was again a bit of a confrontational comedian, and he confronted one audience so much that they all left and complained. So he was sort of fired, and they were left in the Banana Lounge, the room upstairs at the Comedy Cafe. They had no show, so they said, "Can you guys come and do the show?" And we said, "Fine, we've got about an hour of different sketches we can do." So we went. Almost immediately we were doing a whole show, and then they said, "Would you like to go into our downstairs room?" And this is all a prologue to talk about television, but you don't understand what happened on television until you see this vaudevillian background to it all.
The whole establishment of...
Yeah, there was this whole establishment. And around about that time, there were a few kind of canny television entrepreneurs, if you like the ABC, that were actually paying attention to this. So, for example, there was a guy at the ABC called Frank Ward who actually went to The Last Laugh and saw some of these shows. And he saw Rod Quantock and Mary Keneally and these people doing their show and said, "Would you like to come on the ABC and do a show?" So they went and did this thing called Australia, You're Standing in It, which was a sort of a seminal sketch comedy show with those people, Evelyn Crape and Sue Ingleton, these people. And then later on, Frank went back to The Last Laugh and he saw the Melbourne University group doing their show. And he said, "Oh, would you like to come?" And so they did a show called The D-Generation. So there was a very good time in the sense that there was actually someone at the ABC who would go and look at these live comedy acts and say, "Would you like to do a TV show?" This, by the way, doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah,
no one does this anymore.
It's more or less you have to go and try and sell, or just happen to be nowadays a YouTube sensation, and go from there.
Yeah, this is another question we'll go into later, which is that both commercial channels and the ABC now have a system of commissioning editors that read proposals and look at... I mean, it's all very bureaucratised now, whereas Frank just went and said, these guys are funny, would you like to come? I'll give you 6 half hours on the ABC or whatever. Anyway, so we ended up doing this downstairs show. The reason we ended up doing the downstairs show at the Comedy Cafe was that Rod Quantock and Mary Keneally and so had been doing a show called Tram on their little tiny stage, which was at the front of the building. It just went across. It's only a shop front. There was a door and a corridor, and then this little stage. And they set it up as a tram. They had like windows and seats, and there were some people hanging from straps. And somehow they did a whole series of sketches on. Yeah, so Rod Quantock and co decided they would do this show called Bus, where they would actually get the audience. They'd give them a meal at the cafe, then take them downstairs and put them on a bus and take them on a tour of Melbourne. So Rod would keep up a sort of a commentary on famous places, which would all be comic. But they'd actually go to places. They'd go to exclusive places like the Melbourne Club, stop outside, and he'd take them through them. He'd walk through the sort of the Athenaeum Club, saying, "Follow the chicken, rub a chicken on a stick," and so people in cinemas or restaurants, Florentinos in Burke Street, would suddenly have this great line of people coming through, these bewildered customers coming through, while he was sort of going over and giving a sort of a made-up commentary on everyone.
Yeah.
So that was quite a different. That was a completely different kind of cabaret show.
Nowadays you probably get your theatre restaurants trying to be that more entertaining, but that's pretty standout.
It's a very funny, and you need that particular talent to be able to keep up this constant banter and a whole set of jokes about talking to people. I mean, they stop at a police station, take the people through the police station. The police are they'd be going, "This way, everybody. Okay, this is the police station," and whatever, and they make jokes all the way along. Anyway, that meant that the downstairs of the Comedy Cafe was free, so my 2 friends, Peter and Eddie, and I, were asked to do this full-length show. We decided we'd do a show. We're all single men who'd all been through bust-ups, we'd all be sort of... I think Peter and I had both broken up with long-term relationships, and I don't think Eddie had ever had one, so we ended up doing this show about relationships because we realised we needed a woman in the group, so we kind of auditioned around, and we came up with this young woman called Marianne Fay, who I later married, who had just come back from doing theatre in South Australia. She'd written some very funny sketches about the sort of pick-up lines men use and things like that, so we put her in the show, and she was married at the time. Unfortunately, it turned out that she was pregnant, so... Not it was unfortunate that she was pregnant, it was unfortunate that she started the show being pregnant, so about 5 months later she was too pregnant ready to do the show, so we had to replace her. And we interviewed this young journalist who'd been working with the Sun, Herald Sun in Melbourne. She'd been to see our show many times, written a great review on it. Her name was Wendy Harmer. She'd never done comedy, but she could sing, so we put her in the show. And so she came in to replace Mary Ann. That show ran for about 6 months. It was very successful. And at the end of that, when we got into 1982, our group sort of broke up because both Peter and Wendy decided they wanted to be stand-ups. They wanted to do solo. I didn't ever want to be solo. I just liked doing sketch comedy. But they went off to do solo. We ended up finding a venue in Richmond in Melbourne which we could hire out just as a stand-up club. So we used that as a sort of laboratory where we could get up every week. And we used to hire it on Tuesday night and get up and just do small acts in front of an audience. Low-risk situation. Charge people $5 to come in. And if they didn't laugh, we go, well, you only paid $5 when you want, you know. So we had a low risk situation there. Doing that little weekly sort of stand up gig was a very good idea because it meant that you had to come up with some new material because we had to tend to have the same people coming back each week, so you couldn't do the same act. As I said, most comedians get away with having one 20-minute act. They can do that for 5 years. You know, they can do. This is why comedians tour.
Yeah.
They have to tour. They've got to find a new audience every night.
Yeah.
Mind you, that's how you make the money. But they have to tour the world. Literally have to tour the world. Once you've done all the audiences in England, you've got to come out here and, you know, if you're Danny Boy or whatever, you've got to go and do Karratha and Kalgoorlie. You've got to find people who haven't seen you before. So that gave us a great discipline. I'd be writing scripts or whatever. I'd be writing, you know, training films or something, you know, electrical safety, you know, films for the Electricity Commission for a living, or management training films about how to discipline your staff or whatever like that, how to set goals for your sales staff or whatever. And then at kind of 3 o'clock, oh God, I've got to write. Oh God, we're on stage tonight. Oh, I better write 10 minutes of stuff. So you'd have to sit down and actually do that.
Did that inspire you with some sketches down the track? So eventually when the comedy...
Absolutely. That requirement to come up with material all the time meant that you had to constantly invent stuff. But also, doing these shows brought you in contact with other people. So there was a young lawyer at that time who was writing comedy around the place, and his name was Steve Vizard, and he and I started writing stuff together. In fact, we were asked to write a show at one point for The Last Laugh. Ironically, they fired us.
Oh, jeez.
Because I said they didn't like it. It was we actually had protests from the cast who didn't think our stuff was any good. That cast, by the way, are now in obscurity. That was ironic. But I mean, I met Steve Vizard through that, and so by the mid '90s, I had made contact with all those people, and Steve had made contact with all those people, who later became the TV show. So. Around about 1984, another kind of serendipitous thing happened where there was some people persuaded the Australian Film Institute to create a thing called a comedy fund, because there was the great anomaly in Melbourne at that time was all these people working on stage, but there was nothing happening on television. I mean, comedy on television was pretty much Hey Hey It's Saturday. That was sort of the only thing.
The go-to thing.
Yeah, that was the days of the Paul Hogan show were long gone, and you know the Naked Vicar, that was all gone back in the 70s. There was really nothing else happening, and so they set up this thing called the Comedy Fund, and the producer called Bob Weiss said he ran a place called Open Channel, which was like a Metro Arts. It was a bit like a sort of a community video, arts centre, and he said, look, if you want to come along, do some sketches, I'll take them to Channel 7. So Steve Vizard and myself, Marianne, Glenn Robbins, and so on, went and did some sketches. There was this friend of Peter called Mark Mitchell, who was a teacher. We brought him in to be a sort of a compere. We did some sketches. They were sent to Channel 7, and the manager of Channel 7 in Melbourne said, I put this to air. I haven't got any money, but I'll put it to air. I can give you a studio, but I don't have any cash. So we looked at the fund. The fund was $100,000. I think about $20,000 had been spent on hiring Open Channel. And Bob Weiss said to me, and it's the only person who had any sort of television experience, how many shows could you get? There's about 70,000 left. And I said, well, looking at the absolute actors minimum, the writers minimum, we could do 8 shows. The 8 shows at about $8,000 each, which is ridiculous.
Wow.
That's really just writers and actors and a couple of people to run the office.
And that's the current, or the value of the dollar at the time as well. So what would that be to now?
Wouldn't be much more. It would be like doing an hour of sketch comedy for about $30,000 probably today.
Yeah.
Anyway, we figured we could get 8 shows, and we did this show, which was only ever put on in Melbourne, and it went to 11. It was 11 o'clock on a Friday night. It was called the 11th Hour, and we did these 8 shows. And of course, this put us under pressure. Again, we had this thing. We had to come up with some stuff every week, and we sort of relied on some of the stuff we'd done in cabaret.
Yeah.
And we wrote some new stuff, and a lot of the stuff was hopeless. A lot of it, Marianne Fay, for example, used to do a ventriloquist act on stage. She had a life-size female doll, and she used to do a sketch of these 2 girls sitting in a pub, checking out the blokes, and doing the conversation with this big life-size doll. We did that on TV, and we quickly realised that it doesn't work on TV. Ventriloquism doesn't really work on TV. I mean, if it's a little an animal puppet or something like that, like a monkey or something, like
with a personality of
yeah,
its
well,
own,
then we know it's a doll. But if you have a full-size doll, people thought it was someone wearing makeup. They thought it was someone in a costume. And the whole effect, the whole magic ventriloquism doesn't work on TV, because if you think it's someone else doing the voice or whatever. Anyway, we learned a whole lot of things there. Anyway, at the end of the 8 shows, we were sort of hoping that Channel 7, because we had a bit of a following, might actually extend it. They didn't. We got this. There was a message came down from Channel 7 in Sydney going, we don't need these guys from Melbourne, because we've got a whole new show called with Jono and Dano. We've got Jonathan Coleman and Ian Rogers are doing a show, and that's going to be our new comedy show. Well, their new comedy show lasted a week, and we were thrown out. And anyway, so we're all sort of out of work. Our hopes of being the next Saturday Night Live was sort of dashed.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
And a couple of years went past, and then again, serendipity. This freak thing occurred where Clive Robertson, who's a radio personality, was asked to do the late news on Channel 7. And Clive Robertson started to do funny news. He'd be reading the news and go, well, I'm not going to read that, that's just rubbish, And they've given me sport, I don't read sport, And people are starting to watch Clive kind of eviscerate the news. And then this frisson went around television. Oh my God, this is a great idea. Funny news at 10:30. Suddenly everyone wanted funny news at 10:30 at night.
That would be Newsworld, correct?
That was
Newsworld? Or is that something else which evolved
I think it was called something like that. Yeah. So at this time, Mark Mitchell was working on a sitcom in Sydney, and he was constantly pestering the head of Channel 9's comedy department, Lynn Bayonas, going, you know what you need, Lynn? Lynn, you need a fabulous sketch comedy show at 10:30 at night or whatever. So eventually, Channel 9 was thinking that maybe they need something to go up against Clive Robertson. So we went and spoke to them, and we had a show reel. The one thing that the 11th Hour had given us was a good half-hour show reel of funny sketches. And they looked at that and they said, oh, this is pretty good stuff. Yeah, we like to look at that. So we went away and thought, oh, gee, maybe Channel 9 will commission us to do a late-night show, a bit like the 11th Hour. Anyway, about a day later, we get a phone call from Channel 10, who said, we hear you're talking to Channel 9 about doing funny news. And we said, yes. Well, come and talk to us about doing funny news. We're interested. So suddenly everyone seemed to be doing funny news. So we went along and spoke to Channel 10. A guy called Ian Gow had just been hired by Channel 10 to run the network. The network had just been bought by Lowy family, the Westfield Corporation, and they wanted to make Channel 10 the top channel. So Ian Gow thought we want a late night funny news. Anyway, so all of a sudden we've got 2 channels saying we're interested in funny news at late night. Next day, Channel 9 decides they're going to run Coast to Coast with Graham Kennedy. They're going to bring Graham Kennedy virtually out of the grave, out of retirement, 20 years of retirement, to do virtually exactly what Clive Robertson, doing the news with a few jokes with Ken Sutcliffe. And I thought, all right, okay, we still got Channel 10. Then Channel 10 decided they're going to bring Don Lane back to do a funny news show at 10:30 up against Coast to Coast. And John will be doing talkback and taking calls from people. And we went, oh, well, that's, But then Ian Gow called us and he said, look, we don't want you to do funny news, but we like the stuff you did, we like you've got these funny characters. Would you like to do a 1 hour a week show earlier in the evening? And I didn't want to. The 11th Hour had just about killed me. I mean, that was doing an hour a week on $8,000. I mean, it was a killer. I said, I never want to do this again. Anyway, but Mark Mitchell cried a lot and said, please, Ian. So we went in there and we we started doing this show, which was originally at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. So we did the show at Comedy Company. Because we were originally thinking it was going to be very topical, I brought in a lot of people who had done theatre sports, because I knew we needed people who could improv very quickly. People even work without scripts and things like that. So I didn't use all the people in the 11th Hour. I couldn't use Steve Barzard because he was a full-time lawyer who was overseas doing mining contracts for that. But we got obviously Marianne, who I was then living with, Glenn Robbins, Mark Mitchell as the compere as usual, and a few other people, Peter Rosethorn and so on, Tim Smith. And we started doing that show at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. And the other channels threw up everything they could against us. Channel 9 ran Murphy Brown against us. Channel 7 ran up repeats of Fawlty Towers against us. So, which is what they do. You know, if you put up a comedy show, they'll run comedy. They'll run comedy against you. They'll run drama against drama. You'd think you'd counter-program. You'd think you'd put up an alternative for the viewers. But no, they believe in eviscerating the competition as quickly as possible.
And the funny thing is, a few years down the track, Mark Mitchell ends up hosting the Fawlty Towers Hour.
Absolutely. Well, this is how it went. Anyway, we did about 6 weeks at 9:30 on a Tuesday, and we were sort of faltering around ratings of about 13. Now today, if you got a rating of 13, which is 13% of households watching you, they buy you a Rolls Royce. But in those days, 13 was cancellation thing. But then the programmer at Channel 10 had a brilliant idea. A guy called John Stevens, who was a great programmer, looked at the schedule, and they had this thing called the Dolly Parton Show on Sunday nights, which was dying. It was rating 8 because it was up against 60 Minutes. The thing about 60 Minutes was it was a juggernaut. You couldn't beat it. It rated in the 30s. It was rated around about 30 rating in those days, which was a huge rating. And Channel 7 had Alf, which was a show about an alien played by a puppet. You know, it was this puppet character. And the Dolly Parton Show was rating nowhere, and the ABC, no one even switched on the ABC. So they figured it can't do any harm. Let's put these guys at 7:30 on a Sunday night. So they moved the Comedy Company on to Sunday night at 7:30. And it went to this was about Easter 1988. And its ratings went up. And by May, it actually got the same ratings as 60 Minutes. And by June, it passed 60 Minutes, which no one thought could possibly happen. And I think in Melbourne, around about July, we hit a rating of 40. Now, 40 was a rating that normally, like, the grand final got.
Yeah.
And even the network didn't know what to do. we can't even understand it. We couldn't understand. We're looking, going, why are they watching us? We're just doing it.
Where did the books go?
We're doing this crap, and why are everyone watching this show? And it just became this incredibly popular show. What happened at the end of that year was, of course, this set a flurry through. I mean, Channel 9 went into damage control because this was 60 Minutes was a show with an $8 and $9 million a year annual budget, being killed by this show that had a $1 million a year annual budget. A bunch of people who'd never been heard of before. They come out of nowhere, which was part of the attraction, that we were totally new people. Obviously, Channel 9 was sort of distraught that their show, 60 Minutes, which was an $8, $9 million budget a year, is being defeated by the show that had like a $1 million budget. Channel 7, I think, probably belatedly realised that they'd had all these people 3 years earlier and had thrown them away, essentially. And so they actually rang up Steve Izard, who was still being a lawyer, touring the world and doing big mining contracts, things like that. Steve was on pretty good money, and they said to him, you were involved in that 11th Hour, yes. You've seen this comedy company thing. Could you do a show like that? And Steve, to his credit, amazingly took the huge punt of his life and said, yeah. So he actually sort of quit his job as a lawyer, and he gathered together all the people he'd kind of worked with, including people like Steve Blackburn and Jeff Brooks, those people from the Comedy Cafe. He was lucky in that there were a few of the D-Gen people, Magnus Sabansky, Mark Downey and Michael Veitch, sort of wandering around looking for something to do, because half their group had gone to do radio on, I think it was Eon FM. Santo and Rob Sitch and Tom Gleisner and so on had gone to sort of do the show with Jane Kennedy on. They were one of the first funny breakfast teams. Anyway, so Steve sort of collected those people. So almost exactly 1 year after Comedy Company went to air, Fast Forward goes to air on Channel 7. Very similar show. The difference being that they decided they would do mainly television parodies, because that was Steve's forte. Steve wrote great television parodies of classic TV shows. And so come 1989, there's a kind of a bit of an embarrassment of riches, and you've got Comedy Company running on Channel 10 on Sunday nights, and you've got Fast Forward running on Thursday nights on Channel 7, getting equally popular ratings from the people there. So you've got, suddenly, after a long, long period of being virtually no Australian comedy, suddenly there's a kind of Australian comedy boom. In both cases, those shows only lasted a few years, mainly because people burn out. By the end of 1989, I was a kind of a husk, having been working 90 hours a week for 2 years. I couldn't remember my own name, and I wanted to stop. Glenn wanted to stop. Marianne wanted to stop. Mark wanted to go on forever. And I know the same thing happened after a few years of Fast Forward, is that people like Magda and so on just really thought, look, we've done our best work. We don't want to keep doing this forever. If you ever read the history of Saturday Night Live, it's interesting. The same thing happened with Saturday Night Live. After about 2 or 3 years, Belushi and Aykroyd and all these people and Chevy Chase said, look, we've done enough. Yeah. And they all had the problem of having to bring in new casts. In fact, Saturday Night Live, after about 3 years, when all those people went to Hollywood to make movies, they had to bring in a whole new cast, and their ratings sort of went down, and then they sort of slowly had to come up again.
And that's where it came
Fast Forward had to change into becoming Full Frontal, essentially, because it's very, in a way, if you keep the same show going with a different cast, the audience gets a bit sort of confused and goes, well, where's the old people? So they sort of had to kind of, in a sense, rename. Not much, but sort of had to rename Fast Forward to Full Frontal to kind of justify why there were a whole new bunch of people coming in. We were sort of in the process of doing that at Channel 10, but it didn't work because the whole network went out of business. So in 1990, we were in the process of rejigging the show with new people, which was a bit of a job because the people I was working with in 88, 89, that original Comedy Company cast were very brilliant people. They really were. And because they'd done those characters, Glenn had been doing Uncle Arthur in Cabaret. Marianne had first done her sort of Collymore character on stage and so on. I'd been doing the David Rabbitborough character on radio before that. So we'd been practicing all that kind of stuff. And it does take those 6 or 7 years of working in live comedy or on radio to get those acts sort of working. And bringing in new people and starting them from scratch is very hard. Anyway, in our case, it was sort of brought to a stop because Channel 10 went into receivership.
So you were part of that whole...
Oh, yeah. We were at the bottom of the... It was like being run over by a truck, because that was suddenly... It's one situation where you've been delivering shows, they owe you hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you literally come in on a Monday morning, and I remember these things get embedded in your mind. I came into Channel 10 at the Nuttawatting Studios on a Monday morning, and my line producer said, Ian, the station's been placed in receivership. And I was cavalier about the whole thing. I said, that doesn't matter, we have a contract. They have to pay us. We have a contract. I didn't know that when companies go into receivership, all contracts are voided.
Yeah.
Contracts are voided. But it's a contract. It's a legal contract. No, you don't understand the insolvency laws. When administrators are put in charge of a company, all contracts are voided, except the ones with the bank for some reason. For some reason, under our insolvency laws, you see, when a company goes out of business and you dissolve all its assets, employees get the first payouts. You've got to pay them their wages, their holiday, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The next one are the banks, because they've got basically a mortgage. They have a legal charge over the assets. The poor buggers at the bottom, who are the guy down the road who supplies milk for the canteen, they don't get paid. They don't get paid. And people like us who produce shows, you don't get paid. I know that Grundy's, I heard at the time that Grundy's lost about $3 million that was owed to them for programs they delivered.
But you bounced back though later on with Let the Blood Run Free.
Luckily I got the run free done just in time, because what we'd done is around about the end of '89, I realised that Let the Blood Run Free was one of those shows that was on at the last laugh.
Yeah.
That John Pinder commissioned, and again it came out of an improv. It came out of an improv group, and it started off upstairs at Le Joke, the little stand-up venue, where they used to do late shows where they made up this silly sort of centre of the young doctors of a medical soap, general hospital type thing, where they get the audience to throw in ideas, and they do scenes, and they eventually evolved a whole show out of this. So they took it downstairs, and it was one of the most successful shows they ever did, The Last Laugh, because it was this silly medical, just one of those cartoonish things where they'd have a dummy on an operating theatre, and they'd open it up and they'd be pulling out tubing and clocks and everything
just full over the top.
Yeah, and all that stuff, and this ridiculous romance, and Nurse Effie would go, "He doesn't love me, I'm going to commit suicide," and then they'd stop the show and go, "All right, audience, should Nurse Effie jump off the clock tower," or whatever. And of course the audience would go, "Yes," or whatever, and then they got into this wonderful idea of having the audience vote. And I thought, well, we had Pete Rosethorn in Comedy Company, he was from the show. We had Linda Gibson doing I did a quiz show called The Great Epic Game Show, which was a television nostalgia quiz, a bit like a Spicks and Specks. She was in that. Gene Kitson was doing the big gig. And I thought, well, 3 of the people from Let the Blood Run Free are currently on television. And I thought, could we do a show where the audience actually votes? So we did a pilot, which we did at the ABC studios, which was very good for a first episode. And I proceeded to try and hawk that around the networks. And all the networks said, "Oh, this is very funny, but it's not for us." Oh, great. The irony was that in early 1990, when I went overseas for the first time to try and sell Comedy Company overseas, which was a bit of a hard sell, I took over this pilot for Let the Blood Run Free. And one of the English distributors, a wonderful bloke called Simon Willick, who watched it and said, "This is very amusing." He said, "I think, are you going to go into production with this?" And I said, "Well, you're hoping to, Simon." He said, "Well, if you do, I think we can probably sell this to quite a few countries."
Yeah.
He had the sort of Prince Charles kind of thing there. He's a wonderful man, and so he said, "Well, okay, Christ, we've got a situation here. This could get overseas sales. I've got to get someone in Australia to pick it up." So in the end, I just basically said to Channel 10, I didn't want to go back and really do any more Comedy Company. I said, "Look, I'll go back. I will do another series of Comedy Company if you buy this." And I went, "All right." Reluctantly, they agreed. So that year, 1990, we did this sort of 3rd season of the Comedy Company with almost a totally new cast. But they also did Let the Blood Run Free, and they hated it. Channel 10 hated it. It was meant to be sort of a much more risque sort of late night show, but they put it on at like a Monday night 8 o'clock, which is a family thing, which was totally wrong. Because it was a very confronting show. It was so violent.
Oh, I do remember it being on TV and calling up the 0055 number when this is before Telecom blocked the numbers.
Yeah, well, that was the thing, of course, is that we had this thing where we preserved that whole idea. I mean, I take some pride in, as far as I know, Let the Blood Run Free is the first interactive TV show ever done in the world, where people, at the end of the show, they would be literally, should Nurse Effie, commit suicide, call this number for that and call this number for no, and people dialed it, and they did. Of course, what they did was they looped the story, so whether she jumped off the roof or she didn't jump off the roof, by the time you got to the sort of 3rd or 4th scene of the show, the next show, you sort of converged back a bit, but they had alternative openings each week, so that meant, for example, we had to shoot the show week to week. We couldn't do 30 episodes in advance, which is one of the problems these days. Of course, if you do a sitcom nowadays, you have to shoot the whole 30. They'll make you do 30 episodes in advance, and then you put it to air. And if you find out the audience hates it in episode 1, you're stuck with 12 more episodes.
Yeah.
But if you can do something week to week, you're getting that. That was the great thing about doing something like Comedy Company, is you're going week to week. We would tape on a Wednesday night. It would go to air on a Sunday night. You'd have the ratings on Monday. You get feedback on Tuesday. So before you did the next show, you kind of knew what had worked and what didn't work. And of course, these days, because everything is pre-done. Anyway, it was very lucky I sort of bullied Channel 10 to doing Let the Blood Run Free, because ultimately we did do that series, and Simon Willick from RPTA did sell it into about 50 countries overseas, so that I've still got copies of like the Spanish version of it, which is hilarious,
I was gonna say,
and a German version, because they dub everything in Europe is dubbed. And the dubbing artists in Europe are marvelous because they not only do they sort of lip sync the characters, they've got artists who have the same voices. So you have this sort of Italian Pete Roseford, you know. He's finally got a feeling he's doing, you know, doing all this stuff there. In fact, Germany liked Let the Blood Run Free so much that they even commissioned a second series. So we ultimately, a couple of years later, did a second series of Let the Blood Run Free, which was paid for in advance by overseas sales. Channel 10 wouldn't pay a cent for it.
Yeah.
They gave us a studio, which they charged us for, the bastards. I mean, they gave me a studio to do it. They put it on air, but they wouldn't. They then even charged us for the studio. So they eventually, you know, but we had to do it because there was this demand from Germany who loved the show, and Comedy Company. I did manage to sell a kind of a cut down version of Comedy Company overseas, but Comedy Company never went as easily. And the answer was very simply this: that comedy is very culturally specific. And what you can't sell a Kylie Mole character in England, and you can't sell a Greek fruiterer in England. They don't have Greek fruiterers; they have Pakistani fruiterers, and no one can understand that kind of, you know, this guy's just stupid like this. She just goes. They don't have anyone who talks like that. They don't even recognise that accent overseas.
It's too Aussie.
It's too Aussie, and what we had to do with selling Comedy Company overseas, ironically, we had to pretty much take out the stuff that was explicitly Australian and just put, if you like, the generic sketches, so that you didn't get the very things that were most popular in Australia don't work. And obviously you could never sell it into America, so they wouldn't know what. I mean, even if you sell ordinary Australian drama over there, the Americans want it subtitled or dubbed because they can't, you know, we can't understand these Cockney, these Cockney accents, you know, the English accents are too broad. You know, it's not English, it's Australian. They don't know. They can't.
Yeah, they
tell
can't
so
tell the
it's always a problem. Anyway, so we did sell Let Blood Free, and that was one of our sort of successes. And it sold sort of steadily. I mean, we never made a fortune out of it, but it was nice to. What it meant was that for the next 5 or 6 years, every so often, you know, we get a check for a couple $100 from England.
As long as you get some coins.
Well, I'd be sitting there thinking, how am I going to pay this bill? And then, you know, we get this thing from Simon. Oh, here's your quarterly statement. You know, from Africa and Switzerland, we've got wacko, you know, a check for $300. That'll do it.
Wow.
And then after that, of course, everything was just disaster. After Channel 10 went out of business. They were under receivers. They had 2 guys from Channel 9 took it over. And what happened in a way, the worst thing was that, if you like, the goodwill that we'd established with Channel 10 went out the window because of all the Channel 10 executives disappeared. They were taken over by new executives. They didn't know us. They didn't care about us. A couple of these people were Channel 9. They hated the Comedy Company because it was their dire enemy. You know, this was one of the funny things about the television industry is, as you would know, Matt, is that the same group of people constantly rotate around at a management level between all the channels. You know, there are people, we were dealing with someone who had worked for the ABC and then worked for Channel 7 and then worked for Channel 9, was now working for Channel 10. So these people don't have any loyalty to that particular network. They're just sort of, and they all rotate, you know, back and forward. So David Leckie's at 9 and he goes to 7 or whatever thing. And I mean, they're equally ruthless in every network that they work for, but they don't have any allegiance to the people. You know, one day you're working with, you know, one day I'm working with you and we're doing shows together. Then I go to the rival network and my job is to put you out of business. So it's a really weird situation. In that sort of post receivership environment, I did manage to sell a sitcom to Channel 10 called Bingles, which was starring Shane Bourne and Tammy McIntosh, which was just a little working class sitcom set in a panel shop. And then, in conjunction with Crawford Productions, who by now have also ceased to exist, I did a long running sitcom for Channel 7 called Newlyweds, which was about a young married couple with Danny Jones and Chris Cabati. That sort of finished around about the end of 1994. And I've really sold nothing ever since. Since that time, the network's really changed. Since the mid-90s, the entire structure of television has changed so much. Oddly enough, there are more bureaucrats now. There are more levels of administration in television networks than there were then. It's a bit sad, but you'd have to say that the way in which those shows, Comedy Company and Fast Forward, got up will never happen again. That situation where the managing director, like an Ian Gow or whatever, actually rings up people and say, listen, I want you to do a show, come in and, get started. That doesn't happen anymore.
No.
Today, television is an internationally franchised system. Virtually everything you see on television, all these shows at 7:30, be they cooking shows, talent shows, renovation shows, bachelor type shows, dating shows, are all franchises. They're all licensed programs coming from big international marketing companies like Endemol and Fremantle. They've started off in God knows where, Bechuanaland, the Netherlands,
Yeah, it's all over the place.
Tierra del Fuego, and then they are packaged into countries around the world. So we're all watching the same shows now. If you watch Slumdog Millionaire, you suddenly realise that Who Wants to Be a Millionaire in India is exactly the same as Who Wants to Be a Millionaire here.
Yeah.
That the Chaser is straight from England. They even bring out some of the English some of the English chasers sometimes. Obviously, Bachelor, Bachelorette, Married on First Sight.
It's just a franchise.
Sex on First Sight, whatever it is. Yeah, they're all franchises. And the chances of getting up anything, I mean, the idea of having an Australian-made sort of popular entertainment show at 7:30 would be boggling for a television executive today, and especially a bunch of unknown people. It would just never happen. And now that it's become so, I almost hesitate to say, McDonaldized, except I quite like McDonald's. I don't want to insult them. It's worse than McDonald's. I mean, it's even McDonald's sort of has a way of going, oh, we're going to have a new healthy diet or something. Even McDonald's does, in fact, go into countries and have, there's a different McDonald's menu in Sri Lanka, but Australian television is exactly the same as British television, exactly the same as American television. The shows are exactly the same.
Now, how much of the rights do you own for the shows? Comedy Company, because I do actually have one question that a lot of my friends and other people who I've told that I was going to talk to you want to ask.
The issue with the rights to TV shows is quite complex. When you do that show in the first instance, particularly if the show is sort of like a week-to-week show, because you don't anticipate it ever having longevity, but you enter into a contract with the actors and the writers for a license fee to use their scripts and to use their performances for a given time, which is a standard time, used to be 7 years, and there will be, for example, a number of replays in there. So if you're doing a show like back in those days with the Comedy Company people, the actors would sign a license fee where they go, okay, I'm going to perform in this show, you're going to pay me a fee, Channel 10 or Channel 7, whoever gets to show that maybe 4 times over the next 7 years, and after that, well, you've got to pay more or whatever. And if it's ever going to be shown again. So, for example, if the Comedy Company ever went to air on TV again, you'd have to recontract all the actors for a new negotiation.
Yeah.
As far as things like putting it on DVD or whatever, there's always a clause which says that the producer can also exploit. The producer has the right to exploit it in ancillary media, which in those days was VHS, and then it became DVD. Now possibly it's online, and they say, okay, well, there's a formula whereby you pay them a royalty based on their original fee. Therein lies a little bit of a problem. Because the royalty is based on the original fee rather than a percentage of the income, it's quite possible that if you made a big deal, let's say to put an episode of the Comedy Company online, and whoever it was, Netflix, this is ridiculously hypothetical, but Netflix said, oh, we want to put that classic sort of Comedy Company celebrity special online, and we'll pay you $1,000 for that. You go, oh, that's great income. Then you look at your liability under the royalty payments and go, well, according to this, everyone has to get 17% of their original fee. Now, a couple of those people were on $5,000 a week. So, you add up there, well, I'd have to pay that actor. That actor would have to get $350. That actor would have to get $350. In fact, all 10 actors would have to get. It would actually cost us $5,000 in royalties, but we're only making $1,000 from the sale of the program. So there's actually a kind of it's an unfortunate situation. I'm sort of deliberately exaggerating those
Yeah.
figures to make the point, but
Hypothetical.
you
You've
can
already
get
mentioned that,
into a situation where if you release a TV show on DVD or you put it online or you sell it to Foxtel, there's a hypothetical situation where you have to pay more money to the writers and the cast than you're making from the show. So you'd actually lose money in doing it. And
Yeah.
that was, I think, it was a basically mistake with the Actors Awards back in those days, because they based the royalties on the original fee. And obviously people sometimes can be on very big, large fees. But for example, we did sell a cut down of Comedy Company to Foxtel back in the 90s. So we had, I think we got, it was a 26 half-hour version, which was a shortened version of the whole 80 hours of it or so. But Foxtel would pay $500 an episode. Now, luckily, that was already covered, because when you do that original payment, there is an upfront payment. You
Yep.
do an initial payment covering you for the first X amount of income. But you'd have to watch that, because the moment you go over that threshold, once you get over that income threshold, suddenly you're due for another payment. Luckily, not luckily, but luckily the income is so small from people, because people like Foxtel were paying virtually nothing. Foxtel was set up on the basis that Fox Network had a huge repository of stuff in America that they already own, so it cost them nothing to put it in Australia, and they don't have to pay very much there. So there are all sorts of complexities with rights. Basically, the bulk of the rights still remain with the actors and the writers. You only have, as a producer, you own the copyright in the tapes, you own the copyright in the show itself, the concept of the show, and all that kind of stuff. But you are limited to how far you can exploit that before you have to start paying royalties. And even if the royalties themselves aren't huge, the cost of administration, where do you even find someone? Someone who wrote a sketch for Comedy Company in 1988, let's suppose we have to pay them a $50 royalty. Where do they even live?
Yeah.
Where do we even find them? Some of them are deceased.
So that explains why that that hasn't been released on iTunes or whatever, because it's too
Well,
costly.
we could do that, but it would be, well, there were two issues of that. One was this legal thing of having to work out some sort of as soon as people know that you're making money, you'd have to show them that you hadn't exceeded their initial payment. But the other thing is, and I've only just solved this recently, the Comedy Company was recorded onto gigantic 1-inch tapes, big 1-inch thick, 1-inch wide videotapes, which I've had in my garage for 25 years.
Oh, so you've got them?
I've only recently managed to digitize most of them onto hard drives.
Fantastic.
That took me a couple of years, and the difficulty with doing that is you can't even get those tape machines anymore.
Yeah.
I know there's a guy in Brisbane who's got a few of them. I had to find one in Sydney and bring it up in the back of my car. They're the size of they're bigger than a double door refrigerator, these machines.
Wow.
And this one didn't work particularly well, so I had to, and I'm not an electronics guy, but I sort of had to get a manual and go through it and go, okay, all right, so that's got to be, that tension spring's got to be, and okay, and that needs replacing there. It took me about a year to get this thing working, and then I had to laboriously dub these off onto a computer. I mean, I had 140 hours of stuff to do, and sometimes it would take many goes to get even one of them cleanly dubbed across, because halfway through it'd stop and beep and smoke would come out or whatever. I mean, this is the main dilemma. We've got a huge problem in Australia of archival television shows. The tapes are going mildewy and losing, they are getting damp and they've got mould growing on them, and I haven't got the capacity to clean them. There's a whole process for cleaning tapes, which people like the National Film and Sound Archive can do.
Yeah.
I can't do that in my garage. Managed to get through most of that. But the real problem is just the machines themselves. These tape machines were made in the early 80s, and trying to find a working Ampex VPR or a Sony BVH, they're as rare as in America you can get them, but no one's going to ship a whatever it is, a 300 kilo machine from America here when you haven't got any money. So, well, I've managed to do that now. So I've only now just managed to get most of the Comedy Company onto hard drives now. So I've got the whole sort of 80 hours of in some form or another there. But I will gradually put them online. But I'm going to have to. I've already put my David Rabbitboroughs on YouTube. But I'm going to have to clear with people if I start putting other people's stuff on there?
Well, you basically answered my question on that, because you still have a lot of fans out there always looking for that kind of stuff where it pops up randomly on YouTube from you know.
I'm surprised that a lot of people have put stuff on YouTube from comedy. I mean, I don't know where they've got it from, because we did put out a couple of DVDs, but there were sketches. People are putting up sketches that weren't on DVDs. Well, I know that a lot of people must have maybe other videotape editors have made copies. That's fine, you know. As a producer, I can only put them up responsibly. I can't just whack up something.
It's all good and well until
someone says, "Oh, well, I mean, every so often you get people." You know, even at the time of Comedy Company, you get letters from people going, you know, I sent in this sketch about da-da-da-da, and you said you didn't use it, and then I switched on the show and I saw the exactly same sketch, and right back and say, look, that sketch here. Several people have submitted that sketch. So, but I will be over a period of time. I will slowly, as I clear with people, put up some of the classic sketches. I'm going to put up there was a whole series that Mark and Mitchell and I did as two guys sitting on the girder, which always finished with me falling off the girder, which I must say, talk about industrial health and safety. I don't know how I didn't break my neck, because I was falling about 3 meters onto a mattress on a concrete floor, and without any sort of stunt supervision or safety, anything like that. But that was the joke, that I had to fall off this thing and do it a back somersault and land on this mattress. I don't know how we didn't die, but I'll put those up because it's just funny, I suppose, watching this guy risk his life.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for having a chat with me.
That's a pleasure.
And just keep up the great work.
Don't
ever stop. So, but I do hope more and more of your works do eventually get released, even if it's over.
I think we'll.
Yeah, just keep it up. But honestly, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay.
Cheers.